To most people, John Foster Dulles is just an airport in Virginia. But many of our viewers are not most people, and surely are familiar with John Foster Dulles, the influential character of the Cold War that an airport happens to be named after. John Foster Dulles, or JFD for short, was US Secretary of State under President Eisenhower, and as the head representative of US diplomacy, he may actually seem like a terrible choice. He was confrontational and lacked social skills. Winston Churchill said that JFD was the only bull he ever met who carried his own china shop. His brother, Allen Dulles, was the first director of the CIA, and both had connections to a secret society, the controversial Skull and Bones, and both were behind interference, or direct military intervention, in the affairs of Iran, Guatemala, and Vietnam. But who actually was this man, and why does he loom so large in the story of the Cold War? It's easy to see how JFD's image and legacy is that of a hawk, more at ease with nuclear launch codes than with diplomatic protocol. But today we're going to assess JFD's policies and determine if he was indeed a hawk through and through, or a more astute and nuanced politician. I'm your host David, and today we are going to take a look at the life of one John Foster Dulles. This is the Cold War. John Foster Dulles was born in Washington, D.C. on February 25, 1888. His father was a Presbyterian minister from a family with an enviable political pedigree. His grandfather was former Secretary of State John Watson Foster, and his uncle, Robert Lansing, would serve under Woodrow Wilson, also at the helm of the State Department. According to author Stephen Kinzer, during his formative years, JFD was exposed to three major influences that shaped his character and outlook. First, a belief in American exceptionalism, the idea that the US had a right to expand their influence via foreign intervention, learned from both his grandfather and his uncle. Second, a moral standpoint influenced by his father's missionary Calvinism, which took him to view the world stage in absolute terms of black and white, good versus evil, and later epitomized by capitalism versus socialism. Finally, the importance for the US government and private corporations to align their goals for a mutually beneficial expansion beyond the nation's border. The last influence came from JFD's employment with Sullivan & Cromwell, a legal consultancy firm whose specialty was to lobby the US Congress and Cabinet on behalf of large corporate groups. But more on them later. As a young man, Dulles was at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, a member of the Reparations Commission and Economic Council. During this assignment, Dulles was against issuing harsh sanctions against Germany, warning of the dangers of holding Berlin responsible for war reparations. Later on in his life, during the Second World War, Dulles served on the War Trade Board as a lawyer, and after the war, he entered private law practice. By 1949, he had been elected to the Senate of the state of New York, and in this capacity, he had a chance to work behind the scenes as an advisor to the Department of State from May 1950 till the end of 1952. JFD's big break onto the international stage happened on the 21st of January 1953, when newly elected President Dwight David Eisenhower appointed him as his Secretary of State. He had developed a strong friendship with Ike, giving him direct and unprecedented access to the president. He also enjoyed the close cooperation of the CIA, at the time headed by none other than his brother, Allen Dulles. JFD's term as Sec State was marked by a consensus in US policy that world peace could and would be maintained only through the containment of communism. This consensus allowed Dulles and Eisenhower to sign security agreements with friendly nations, while at the same time reducing both the number of troops in the US military as well as the production of weapons. Well, conventional ones anyway. This approach became known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. During his tenure, JFD faced, and sometimes directly drove, some of the major international crises of the 1950s. The coup d'etat in Guatemala and in Iran, the escalation of the conflict in Indochina, the Hungarian Revolution, and of course, the Suez Crisis. After the resolution of this last challenge, JFD was diagnosed with advanced stage colon cancer. Despite his quickly declining health, Dulles stayed at his post for a further 3 years until he resigned in April 1959. John Foster Dulles died only a few weeks later on the 24th of May. Now, we could fit that bio onto the back of a box of cereal. What a great way to halt global communism. But of course, there is so much more to JFD than just that brief synopsis. So let's get into that. Remember that law firm I just mentioned, Sullivan and Cromwell? Well, in the first half of the 20th century, JFD's early employers represented $170 million worth of American corporate activities in Cuba. In February 1917, when a liberal military insurgency had opposed the government of Cuban conservative President Menocal, these rebels took control of Oriente province, directly threatening American-owned sugar plantations, and it was feared that if they seized power in Havana, they could have jeopardized even more American investment on the island. US landowners called Sullivan and Cromwell for help, and they handed the case to JFD. The young lobbyist paid a visit to Uncle Robert, better known as Secretary of State Lansing, pleading for a muscular intervention in support of Menocal. Lansing complied, dispatching a contingent of Marines to watch over the sugarcane plantations and provide support to the Menocal government. This has become known as the Sugar Intervention of 1917. Now, let's skip forward to the years when JFD was the Secretary of State. Our longtime subscribers already know about US and British-backed coup against Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh in August of 1953. This was JFD's first major display of interventionism in the internal matters of a foreign power. Both him and President Eisenhower agreed that Mossadegh's plans to nationalize Iranian oil were a threat to US influence in the region and a possible first step for communist penetration. Author Stephen Kinzer argues that this was in fact a missed opportunity for Dulles to increase US influence in Iran. Mossadegh's ideology was essentially anti-colonialist, and the US government could have easily positioned itself as a natural ally for enemies of colonialism. But, well, that's not how it played out. Dulles was also central to another coup when he orchestrated the overthrow of the legitimate Guatemalan government of Prime Minister Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz had been elected to office in March 1951 on the back of a program centered on land reform, which would benefit small local landowners to the disadvantage of the American-owned United Fruit Company. Such policy led both Washington and private interests to fear that Guatemala was about to steer the wheel sharply to the left, and in late 1953, President Eisenhower ordered head of the CIA, Mr. Dulles, well, that's the other one, to prepare for Operation Success, a US-backed military insurrection against Arbenz, led by Colonel Castillo Armas. In the meanwhile, Dulles, JF this time, made diplomatic preparations to lend legitimacy to the operation. Through his efforts, in March of 1954, he got the Organization of American States to approve a new resolution, one that recognized the threat of international communism in the Americas as grounds for intervention. Now, all the Dulles brothers needed was a casus belli, and they got it when in April of 1954, Arbenz made a deal with Czechoslovakia to purchase Soviet-made armaments. Clearly, communism was infiltrating. Operation Success was go. Now, we've already covered the Guatemalan coup in another video, so I'll only add a couple of fun facts. This intervention was not a covert black ops intervention carried out in secret by the CIA. This operation was fully sanctioned by the US Congress on the 29th of June, 1954, following a resolution driven by some guy called Lyndon Johnson. Interesting facts 2 and 3, Sullivan and Cromwell was the law firm that had helped United Fruit to draw up their contracts with previous Guatemalan President Ubico in 1936. And Alan Dulles, the CIA one, had been a board member for, yep, that's right, United Fruit. This shows the tight personal and business connections between the Dulles brothers and Guatemala. This was captured by seminal Mexican mural artist Diego Rivera. His work of art, Gloriosa Victoria, of November 1954, depicts the Dulles brothers front and center. They're seen holding a nuclear bomb with the face of Eisenhower while they handle bundles of dollar bills to the rebel Colonel Castillo Armas. Subtle. Guatemala and Iran are not usually thought of as being frontline countries in the 1950s Cold War, but JFD didn't believe in neutral participants when it came to the worldwide conflict of East versus West. To him, the non-aligned leaders were just Soviet allies in disguise. America had a duty to intervene in these countries to actively contain the spread of communism and Soviet interference abroad. JFD's key doctrine to contain the projection of Soviet power had been unveiled on the 12th of January 1954 during a speech to the Council on Foreign Relations. This was known as massive retaliation. Sounds like a Norwegian black metal band, but in the context of the Cold War, this doctrine involved the deterrence of massive retaliatory power to protect the US and its allies from Soviet aggression. This power that was implied, of course, was of the nuclear variety. Now, massive retaliation was never actually implemented, otherwise I'd be speaking to you from Vault 69. But on at least one occasion, JFD got very close to putting it in practice. That was during the siege of Dien Bien Phu. You'll recall from our earlier video that this was the last major battle of the Second Indochina War, fought in 1954 between the French garrison and the Viet Minh besiegers. The US Joint Chiefs of Staff had planned for Operation Vulture, a large-scale aerial attack in support of the French. JFD strongly supported this plan, however, believing that the planned 98 bombers and 450 jet fighters were not enough, he floated the possibility of dropping atomic bombs on General Giap's troops. However, the Chiefs of Staff and President Eisenhower opposed the idea of using even tactical nukes, and eventually vetoed the whole operation. Okay, so clearly a hawk, right? Well, we need to also consider examples which show JFD as a more balanced and nuanced politician, as well as a skilled diplomat, despite Winston Churchill's cutting remarks. During his tenure as advisor to the Department of State, JFD strongly endorsed the Schuman Plan, the first step to the creation of the European coal and steel community, the first incarnation of the European Union. Love it or hate it, this community was a guarantee for peace in Western Europe, and JFD clearly saw that. Mr. Dulles was also put in charge of leading negotiations for the peace treaty with Japan, signed in San Francisco on the 8th of September 1951. He was recognized as skillfully completing a stalling process, ending military occupation of Japan, and restoring peaceful cooperation between Tokyo and the Western powers. Now, when it comes to his time in office as Secretary of State, let's focus on 1956, the year of the two crises, Suez and Hungary. You already know from our recent videos that the Suez crisis was triggered when Egyptian President Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Anglo-French Suez Canal Company on the 26th of July, 1956. In September, Secretary Dulles attempted a peaceful resolution of the mounting crisis, wanting to prevent any possible Soviet involvement. He proposed the creation of the Suez Canal Users Association, comprising 18 naval powers. The association would have given Britain, France, and Egypt an equal stake in the canal, but his idea failed to win the full support of the contending powers. In October, the British government repeatedly hinted that it might resort to force in dealing with Nasser, to which JFD refused to provide any support from the US, military or otherwise. When the British and French eventually did attack Port Said, Dulles' main concern was to dissociate the US from their action. On a broader scale, he wanted to dissociate the US from European colonialism. This was a radical change of policy compared to JFD's precedents in similar scenarios. Think about the overthrow of Mossadegh, for example. Not only that, JFD was also wary of Nikita Khrushchev's threat of entering the conflict, a threat which would not discount the use of tactical nukes, if not strategic ones. JFD's final response was to pressure Britain and France into accepting a UN-sanctioned ceasefire on the 6th of November. Moreover, Eisenhower's administration backed a UN resolution which publicly condemned the invasion. Now, while handling the trouble in Egypt, Dulles also had to contend with the events of the Hungarian uprising. For 13 days, from October 23rd to November 4th, 1956, crowds of Hungarian demonstrators had forced the resignation of the Communist Party, as well as the retreat from Budapest of Soviet occupation forces. On November 1st, the new democratic government under Imre Nagy announced Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact and the adoption of a position of neutrality. Nagy appealed to the UN and the Western powers for protection, but Soviet armored columns rolled back into Hungary, crushing the democratic experiment on November 4th. An estimated 2,500 Hungarians died and 200,000 more fled as refugees. During the revolution, both Eisenhower and Dulles delivered speeches on their Voice of America radio, expressing the sympathy for the rebels, but nothing beyond that. This lack of action was harshly criticized at the time and even since. But a Department of Defense report, declassified in 2017, paints a more complex picture. Since the start of the uprising, Eisenhower and Dulles did intend to bring the Hungarian crisis to the attention of the UN Security Council, but hesitated to do so. They feared this could be seen as an electoral move to gain votes from Eastern European immigrants. Eventually, JFD made up his mind and instructed the US ambassador to the UN, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., to discuss Hungary at the Security Council on the 28th of October. The issue was raised, but the Soviet delegates stalled processes, and the only decision was to convene again in 5 days' time. Meanwhile, Eisenhower met with both the Dulles brothers to discuss a possible intervention outside of a UN mandate. Ike and John eventually decided against it, unwilling to chance a military escalation in Eastern Europe. JFD's plan for the next Security Council meeting was to introduce a resolution calling for Soviet withdrawal from Hungary, supervised by UN observers. JFD sought backing from the UK representative at the council, Pearson Dixon, who offered another idea: to use the session on the 1st of November to simply condemn the Soviets and postpone final deliberations for 2 more days. While this was going on, however, events were escalating in Hungary. Nagy declared independence from Moscow, while Khrushchev steeled his resolve to intervene. This was the week in which the French and the British had occupied the Suez Canal, and the Soviet leader wanted at all costs to avoid the perception of weakness. Dulles' approach to the Hungarian crisis was to avoid direct intervention, but prevent a military escalation. And while he sought to involve the Security Council, procedural delays allowed events to overtake him, and an American decision was made for them. Inaction, which maintained the status quo but risked nothing for the United States. Now, the final word is with you. Was JFD generally an aggressive interventionist, driven by 3 forces of American exceptionalism, Manichaean worldview, and corporate interest? Or was he an astute statesman who did what was best for his country and adapted his approach based on risk and opportunities? We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, consider supporting us via patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.